Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. It's good to see you.
I'm Al McFarlane. Are we live?
I believe we are.
Okay, great. Typically, we have a handoff from the station, but I think we're straight into it. Shelly, good to see you. Good afternoon. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along today. Got a couple of great interviews today for the program. One is with my first guest, Shelley Carthen Watson. She's the CEO of the Minneapolis YWCA. And the YWCA has been leading a number of critical conversations in the Twin Cities about race and culture, about empowerment for everybody, particularly looking at the challenges around race in this society. Shelley, good afternoon and welcome to Conversations with Al McFarland.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's talk about you first of all. You're an attorney and have done a lot of work in the legal area around human rights, civil rights. Tell me your background first of all.
Well, I've been an attorney. I'm now a recovering lawyer. I was an attorney for about 36 years. First in private practice as a partner at Robbins Kaplan, and then a stint as Deputy Commissioner of Human Rights in the Ventura administration. And then most recently for about 22 years at the University of Minnesota in-house, handling labor and employment matters.
Well, let's talk about what you all are doing. In October, you had a forum on race featuring Ijeoma Oluo. Correct me if I'm saying that wrong.
No, you
And
got
then
it right.
most recently, you did a forum on race, critical race theory. Uh, if you would walk through both of those events and walk through why it's important that the YWCA is moving this work forward.
Well, our first event was part of our annual It's Time to Talk series, which we have been doing for many, many years, where we bring in a speaker to have critical conversations about race, followed up by facilitated dialogue circles, where people can actually talk with one another about what they've seen and heard as part of that process. What was wonderful about our speaker this year is she actually gave us concrete steps on what each of us can do to not only recognize what we needed to work on, but what we could actually do to address the issue of race in this country. And it was, I think, probably one of the best ones that I've ever seen. We had about, 600 people that
Online?
signed up to see it. Yes.
Mhm.
And then we followed that up with our forum on critical race theory. And we were very fortunate to have the incredible Duchess Harris, who is the former chair, the inaugural chair of the American Studies program at Macalester, and a noted scholar on race and the law, as our moderator. We had Representative Cedric Frazier from the Minnesota legislature, who also happens to be an attorney for Education Minnesota. So he sees critical race theory and opposition to it in real time. We had Tanisha Williams, who was the part of the African American Policy Forum, and a colleague of Kimberly Crenshaw, who did the original research and coined the term critical race theory. And then we had Uhuru Williams from the University of St. Thomas, who we all know is a phenomenal scholar in this area. And we had almost 650 people signed up for the forum. We actually sold out and had to close down um, registration. But it was an amazing evening that talked about what critical race theory is, what it isn't, how the opposition has grown and assumed the face and the impact that it has, and finally, what we can all do um, on our part to both understand our history, to understand the attacks on critical race theory, and to help support it.
So let's go through the basics and provide a definition because I think it's still a catchphrase that is widely circulated, but very much not understood, not with clarity. And so it's become a rallying cry for the opposition to capture everything that's not progressive and everything that is or everything that challenges the status quo. Put it that way. That's what I meant. So tell us, how do you define it, and what have you learned as you've been exploring this?
Well, first of all, critical race theory is a law school course. It's not being taught in elementary schools and preschools, as fearmongers would have us believe. It's really a practice, and it looks at how the fiction of race itself has been used to impose racial inequities in our society.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, see, the best way to put it is it's a belief, this belief that we have that the past is in the past and it should stay there, and how we use that sort of objective to foster the racial and social inequities that we have today. It's the equivalent of sort of burying our head in the sand and refusing to acknowledge what has happened in the past and how it has not only continued to create systemic racism and inequities, but it's also distorted the lens through which we view everything that's happening today.
I have a document that starts off talking about the centrality and intersectionality of racism. And it starts off saying that racism exists everywhere in American life, from within our own thoughts to our personal relationships, to our places of work, to our education and judicial systems. And that it says that racism isn't just the actions of individuals, but it's the embedded, or it is embedded in institutions, systems, and culture. It is our way of life. Comment on that.
I think that is so true. It permeates everything that we say and do. You've heard lately with the COVID pandemic that racism is a public health crisis. There's environmental racism, where people of color are exiled to particular neighborhoods, but those are also the neighborhoods where they locate factories, where you have industrial pollution. There is racism in the criminal justice system, the inequities in both policing, the inequities in the availability of counsel, the inequities in how the lens through which judges view identical behavior, but the sentencing is radically different depending on the race of the particular defendant, and the actual sentencing itself. Racism permeates itself in the selection of juries. Then we have the electoral system. We've seen over the last years the role that race plays there. The structural, the boundaries that are, the barriers, that are erected to keep people of color from being able to vote, from gerrymandering the various districts and pitting candidates of color against each other or grouping us all in one district, to preventing us from registering to vote, from closing down polling places in neighborhoods that are predominantly of color. It permeates everything that we say and do, our educational system, how we allocate funding to schools, which means that those schools that are in less affluent neighborhoods receive less fundings, and our children do not receive the quality of public education that others do. And when we try to exercise the right to provide better education for our children, we're punished for it criminally. It permeates every single aspect of American life.
The document I'm looking at talks about the challenge to dominant ideology. It says that in law and other arenas, there's a belief that concepts like neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy can be fully actualized. But critical race theory says, hold on, how can you be truly neutral on issues of race when racism is actually baked into the fabric of the culture? Meaning it can't, and it points out that claims of objectivity and color blindness can be ways in which the dominant groups camouflage their interest in the order of the day, what's best for them. And the things you just described, where policies in housing, education, reflect that that's how it is. Expand on that if you would.
Well, this whole idea that things can be gender neutral or race neutral are a fallacy. I mean, you're looking at me today, and how can you say you ignore the fact that I'm female and not male? It doesn't happen. But we do that to sort of bury our heads in the sand, to not have to address the fact that there are differences and that they affect different groups of people in different ways.
Social justice. So how does the question of social justice come into this conversation?
Well, I think that we all have, well, I think everyone has different definitions of social justice, but I think to be a social justice warrior means that you have an obligation to educate yourself on the inequities that exist in our society and understand why they exist, figure out your role in coming up with a solution, and act on it. And I think when you think of critical race theory, it means you, number one, acknowledge that these systems exist, whether or not you think your ancestors were to blame or not, but these systems do exist. And we have to spend time examining how we can dismantle them, how we can change them so that we don't keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again and perpetuating those inequalities. So if you call yourself a social justice warrior,
Mm-hmm.
that's what you have to constantly be aware of, on the lookout of. You have to change the lens through which you view the systems and norms of our society.
Yeah, and so that leads to the question of the value of experiential knowledge. And I think in critical race theory, there's a statement that lived experiences of people of color, however expressed, like storytelling or family history, biographies, parables, scenarios, chronicles, narratives, etc., they're crucial to understanding racism and oppression, and that they are necessary in our quest for liberation. From the academic to the legal to the activist arenas, lived experience must be taken seriously. And as I read this, Shelley, I think about, there is this narrative about, let's put it really simple, uh, you know, George Washington and the cherry tree cannot tell a lie, right? And there's this glorification of a narrative that we know is patently untrue. It's like Mary had a little lamb, it's a fable. It's not a caricature, but it's I can't think of the right phrase in Spanish, a modismo or locución, a saying. But so our upbringing is guided by all of this shorthand, and the shorthand serves to bring catechism, that's what we're looking for, order to action, and to encourage us to see and say the same thing, to hold the same set of values. But the values it asks us to embrace and hold are the values that have created this white supremacist strategy that serves white people and that does not serve Black people. Certainly, it has served the culture's capability to enslave other human beings, to resist efforts to undo slavery. And as we have done that, and as we have arisen and brought and encouraged and fomented change in society, the resistance remains. And the narrative that created it is still there, seeking to be both invisible and not challengeable. What we're saying now, I think, is that this moment and the future call for all of us validating, valuing, exploring, examining our personal stories, my personal lineage. My grandpa's grandpa, his story, my grandma's mom, her story matters, and that narrative, their experience that brings me to this moment, really is the more accurate telling of the truth of our country and of our humanity. Am I on the right track with this conversation?
Absolutely. As I always say, critical race theory is actual American history.
Mm-hmm.
Reduced to its essence, that's what it is. And our lived experiences are no less valid than anyone else's. I think what's important for the majority of our country to understand is that you cannot go through life judging, evaluating, seeing things according to your own lived experience. Your lived
Oh,
experience is not mine.
mhm.
Your child gets up and goes to school every day. I was in the first group of students in my hometown to be bused. And I remember rolling up into the parking lot of the school in the bus. I was bused across town. Um, we lived in the barrio at the time, and I was bused across town to a predominantly white neighborhood. And I remember the parents standing there, throwing things at the bus, holding up signs, yelling and screaming. I was 8 years old
Mm,
getting off that bus. A year later, they recalled the entire school board
mhm.
to get rid of them. I remember, as a young lawyer going to court and being mistaken as a defendant. Um, I remember shopping for getting right out of law school. You go to look for an apartment and they find out you're African American and it's not available. Our lived experiences are important, and they have just as much value as the myths about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all of the other people who, quote unquote, founded this country and made it what it is. And we have a right to point out our lived experiences, to value them,
Mhm.
but also um, call people on how those experiences have shaped us, but they have also shaped the systems in our society. They don't get a pass by saying, well, that's just your lived experience.
Mhm.
No, my lived experience is a result of the past.
Mhm.
And it has, um, my lived experience, I guess, has uh, suffered perhaps or been impacted, is maybe a better way to put it, by these inequalities that are rooted in the past.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. I'm talking with Shelley Carthen Watson. She's President and Chief Executive Officer of Minneapolis YWCA. She's been in that position since August of 2021. She's a nationally renowned labor and employment law expert, and she came to the YWCA. Did I say YMCA?
YW.
I said YW. Okay, YWCA from the University of Minnesota, where she served as a senior associate general counsel in the office of the general counsel, providing legal advice and counsel for a public research institution with over 30,000 employees. And prior to the university, she was a partner in the law firm of Robbins, Kaplan, Miller, and Cerisi. She was the first African American woman to become a partner in a large law firm in the state of Minnesota. And she's also a former deputy commissioner for the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. She's also served as executive director of the Hennepin County Bar Association and Hennepin County Bar Foundation. She's an honors graduate of McAllister College in St. Paul and received her law degree from Northwestern University School of Law in 1985. Shelley, it's really great to have this conversation with you, and such an impressive record of engagement, involvement, and in leadership. And I think you bring a certain what's the right gravitas to this discussion, right? And because Shelley, it amazes me how uh, powerful people in institutions walk and act and move in a way that they almost dare us to say what we truly feel, or we are so conditioned by the oppressive nature we read it and react to it in a way that dismisses our own integrity, our own belief, our own hurt and pain, because we have been conditioned to believing that that is inconsequential. It's unimportant, and it's certainly unimportant when compared to the massive, immeasurable accomplishment of white people or of the institution or of the organization of the society and of the culture. But that is really the problem. And the challenge here is to recognize us for us and and pull the curtain away, right?
Right.
And let us disaggregate all of these layers upon layers upon layers of deception uh, and um, and manipulation, and call it what it is. And in the process, free ourselves, to be ourselves, to tell our truth, and to, in doing so, enable others who were vested in that to free themselves as well. That's what I think. What do you think?
I believe I'm 100% in agreement with you. Life is too short to not be able to bring our authentic selves in every setting in which we enter, whether it is at school, whether it is at work, whether it is in the boardroom. As you said, our lived experiences are valid and they deserve to be shown, they deserve to be taken into consideration, they deserve to be used as a basis for our opinions, our suggestions, our proposals. They are no less valid than anyone else's. And we get to bring our entire selves to the table. And you don't, there's an expression, what is that? There was a movie years ago, a soldier story, and it was based on the segregated troops in World War II. And when one of the main characters is who actually sort of denied himself, who felt that he had to hide himself in order to fit in. When that person is finally killed, and he says, they hate you anyway. You do all this, and they hate you anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I am me. At the end of the day, I have to answer to me. I have to look myself in the mirror and know who I am. And if you don't do that, you will make yourself crazy. Mm-hmm. And the trauma of that will eat away at you.
So critical race theory, my notes here say, draws from many different fields in order to create a powerful and nuanced framework for engaging with race and racism. And it says that there's no one answer, no one discipline, no one path to freedom. It says let's use all of the tools in the toolbox to help educate folks so we can all get free. And I think that really is a powerful statement. It suggests that there is no single simple anything, that there are many, many pathways, many ways of knowing, many ways of doing, and that we simply must learn to validate that. It reminds me, Shelly, there was a gentleman who was in town here named Philip Emeguali. I think he was associated with Hamlin University, but he was a computer technician who won an international award for developing a parallel computing system that was faster than a supercomputer. And so I just remember interviewing him, and the story sticks with me. And he said he was from Nigeria. He thought back and he wanted to apply for this strategy for speeding up supercomputing or doing more computations in less time. That how did America get on the path? How did the world, the industry get on the path of a supercomputer? And everything sort of developed through, say the 40s and IBM and, the computer age, industrial age, to where the supercomputing model became the predominant strategy for doing computations. But it wasn't the only one. There were a number of ways to compute. He said he thought back to his village days and said, I wonder if I look at this supercomputer as an elephant, that's kind of what it is. It does things. But can you get the same amount of work done if you can harness 50,000 chickens? Mm-hmm. And so it's a question of not believing that any one system is sacred, that something is the way it is for a reason. Maybe it was convenience, expediency. It was appropriate for the set of problems that need to be solved at that time for somebody, but it never was the only way. And that our job is to go back in history and examine the progression of ideas, right? And see where the deviation occurred, the deviation that allowed us to accept the devaluing of our humanity and of our existence, the deviation that allowed others to create false narratives that allowed them to debase themselves by debasing us, right? And let's look at the consequences of it all. And even in doing that, not be judgmental for the sake of being judgmental, but rather for being clear in our analysis. And how do we take all of this knowledge and move forward. Well, I think that's where we are. What do you think?
I think it's a watershed moment, and that everything is on the table. I think everything that we've ever been taught about our history needs to be taken apart and examined. And as I said, I'm big on, reforming the lens through which we view everything, all of our policies, all of our systems that we have, to see whether or not these our history has resulted in these inequalities that are embedded in how we do things, and if our unconscious bias or conscious bias has led us to believe that African Americans have a higher pain tolerance, and therefore physicians should not probe or treat us the same way,
Mhm.
or that that there is only one learning style, and if that is not a style that is conducive to African American students, then that doesn't matter. If that learning style or this pedagogy is the result of a racist system or perception of how students should be taught, and it disadvantages our students, then we need to examine that and take it apart.
She-
Um,
Shelley, I'm
Political
so glad
everything.
that you and the YWCA have taken the lead in bringing this public conversation forward. Tell me how it is and why, from your experience as a leader now, your organization has elevated this work. Because I look at places around Twin Cities, and the logo or the slogans expanding what we're about are really phenomenal. Uh, what you're doing is nothing less than bold and intentional, I believe. But tell me about the organization and where it has evolved to and where it's going.
We have a long, long history. We desegregated the YWCA nationally, had Dorothy Height on our national board, and as a national officer, we desegregated our facilities in the 40s, and had programming for African American communities. And we've all heard about, young women
Mhm.
who came to the city and needed a place to work.
Yep.
But our racial justice work was in effect even before the signing of the Civil Rights Act. Even here in the Twin Cities, we were one of the first buildings to be owned by women. We had the first integrated pool in the Twin Cities, first African American board member, our beloved Phoebe Givens, and whose daughter Roxanne later became chair of the board of the YWCA. This is who we are. This is what we do. And we have continued to do this work. We have an anti-bias curriculum for our early childhood education. We have 5 centers. We have our girls and youth programs that seek to educate young women of color on STEM careers. We also have our racial justice and public policy department. And so not only are we educating people about issues of race, but we are constantly monitoring legislation, policies that are being put into effect that disproportionately affect people of color. And that means meeting with legislators. That means educating parents on different issues. This is who we are, and it's embedded in everything that we do.
Shelley, thanks so much for being with me today. Just stick around for a minute. I know you've got more to do. Stay as long as you can, but I want to introduce you to my next guest because I think you'll enjoy hearing his conversation as well. And AZ, if you're there, why don't you bring in Dr. Derek Lamont West to the conversation. Dr. West is joining us, I think, from Atlanta. Dr. West, how are you?
Correct. I'm fine. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Please meet Shelley, Carthen, Watson, and Dr. Derek West.
Nice to meet you, Ms. Watson. Loved what you were saying. Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think we both are going to love what you have to say, Dr. West. You said call you Derek, so I'll do that.
Please do.
Dr. West, in reading your bio, though, is a board-certified interventional radiologist specializing in the treatment of pancreatic adenocarcinoma and other genitourinary cancers. I think I nailed it.
Yeah.
Okay. He's acting associate professor at the Department of Radiology and Imaging Sciences at Emory University School of Medicine, and specializing in the treatment of pancreatic. I said that already. You joined Emory Healthcare in 2017, MD from Loyola Stritch School of Medicine in Maywood, Illinois, Master's in Science and Clinical Investigation at Northwestern University in Chicago, where he also completed his diagnostic radiology residency and vascular interventional radiology fellowship. Well, he's come to my attention because of a press release I received a couple of days ago about Radiology Health Equity Coalition being created to address healthcare disparities. And I'll just share in a synopsis what I took from this and what motivated me to call his organization. It said that 8 major radiology organizations are collaborating in the formation of a radiology health equity coalition to positively impact healthcare equity in the radiology arena and beyond. And it says, while disparities and inequities in healthcare have been evident for many years, the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified the disproportionate numbers of people of color and rural residents in the U.S. affected by barriers to care. And so I thought about that. What does that mean? Because we talk about disparities and lack of access, et cetera. But when you think about medicine as a layperson, you think about your doctor, your primary doctor.
Yep.
You know about the radiologist when you have a procedure, but you're not really connected to the radiologist. But when I thought about this, so this is really upstream. The radiologists are the guys that go before, right? Even your procedure. I said, this is a way for practitioners to organize more intervention, more education, more awareness than we've ever had an opportunity to experience and know. So that's
Absolutely.
kind of where I came to the conversation.
Sure.
And I called Dr. Derek West is here to tell me about that. Dr. West, am I saying that the right way, first of all?
You are saying it the right way. And to understand why this is so important, particularly in the field of radiology, is to understand that health disparities are not exclusive to one type of practice in medicine. It goes around the board across everything. A case in point to understand this, radiology has known for a long time that there have been healthcare disparities, whether it's related to gender, sex, sexual orientation, race. And the reason I bring it up, I'm gonna bring up something that just came out this year, but it sort of paints the whole picture, which talks about imaging disparities in radiology. And it looks at, suppose you are a person who needs to go and get examined for something and you require radiology imaging characteristics. And I'm going to be very specific about this because there have been several papers written about this almost 15, 20 years ago that respectfully talked about the issues for African-American women in breast cancer. Why is it that African-American women, when they're diagnosed, are at a higher stage and have shorter half-lives as a result of breast cancer? And what they looked at is, this particular paper looked at pre-proceduring, which is if you're a person who needs to get a mammogram, what are the limits that can cause? So things like underuse of screening mammography, a lack of physician recommendation, and these things are all related to a disparity that's created. Now, let's talk about the procedure itself when you go in to get a mammogram. If you are in a community that does not have skilled technologists, the imaging may be not enough to be able to diagnose or be able to predict whether or not there is something that needs to be treated. And the other thing that happens in a lot of communities, either rural communities, because that is also an important disparity that we have to be cognizant of, is that disparities aren't limited solely to one of these. There's often an array of these things that are associated. And so whether you are in the inner city where your hospital that you have access to does not have the newest imaging methods, or if you're in a rural community where there's no hospital within 40 miles of where you live, these are things that change whether or not you're going to get the procedure. And again, this is specific to radiology, but this goes across the board. But this is why radiologists start to really look at this and say, we are a part of the problem that's causing this. And so then your post-procedural, you've gotten your mammogram, and there may be something abnormal. There's inadequate follow-up. Did somebody call to tell the people that have these mammograms that have an abnormality that they have an abnormality, or call their physician to make sure their physician contacted them to follow up on it?
Mhm.
These types of things create that type of disparity. So these disparities are related to more than just disparities in and of themselves by themselves. I think this is actually a very important point, which is that there are social determinants of health that play the role that I'm speaking of into this. So there are a lot of ways that comes in, whether it's economic stability, educational access, healthcare access, your neighborhood, your social and community context. These are all things that create that disparity, and that disparity can vary from person to person. And what we have found is that there is a racial component to it. There is a rural component to it.
Mhm.
There is a sexual gender component to it. So the reason why this all becomes important is because when we talk about treating the social determinants to treat this disparity, this was a new change for radiology to really look at this and address it in a very impactful manner. And so the Health Equity Coalition that you spoke of
Mhm.
was an incredibly new change for radiology. The organizations that we're speaking of, first of all, the American College of Radiology, there is the National Medical Association, the American Board of Radiation, Society of Interventional Radiology, rather, the Radiologic Society of North America, several others. And the reason I say their names and bring this up, because these are among the most premier organizations in radiology.
Mhm.
And together, they decided that this cannot happen in just one or a few of these. All of us have to be involved. And that involvement allows for all of these organizations to work together and form this coalition. And that's why the coalition itself becomes so important, because now everybody has their skin in the game, so to speak, on this. They are all mixed into this to really see if we can fix it. So there are large meetings that are happening with people who represent each organization. And they're forming mobilization teams that do canvas resourcing and developing a pledge and principles, identifying goals, developing operational action plans, and creating a structure for this organization. And what it's allowed is for us to come up with a game plan for this, one that really directly speaks to what the ultimate goal is, which is imaging equity. We want everybody to be able who get mammograms to be able to get quality mammograms, get quickly followed up to reduce that disparity. So in so much as we have something to do with the disparity, we are trying to fix that imaging equity issue. And there are four ways that we're kind of looking at it right now. One is community outreach and advocacy. And so you'll see that the Radiology Health Equity Coalition, one of the best things that we're doing is getting involved with community organizations that already have the access that we don't necessarily have directly. They go in communities to create health access to people, for example, and look at some of these issues. And our involvement in that directly affects whether or not imaging equity to these communities is reached. We also need to do some homework on this, frankly. What's the data on this? So there have been some great papers that have been written about this that are within radiology itself. And even before radiology, I'd like to point out, many of you are aware of this, that none of the stuff that we're talking about right now is new. This has been going on for years. And the year 2002, the government said this is so severe that we are going to put together a request to the Institute of Medicine to see the extent of racial and ethnic disparities, identify potential sources of these disparities, and suggest intervention strategies. And this ended up being a book that you can get right now called Unequal Treatment.
20 years
And
ago.
It is an incredible piece of work because it really points out in a very succinct and direct manner that disparities in healthcare exist and require focused, active responses. This is in 2002. We are now almost 20 years past that, and we're still having the same questions. Except this time, at least from the radiology perspective, and I think it is really going on in other parts of medicine, that this has now become very clear to everyone that that disparity is directly affected, not by the patients, but by the system and the physicians themselves. I'm even going as far as to say, people genuinely, we are all, as physicians, we are really trying to do the right thing.
Right.
But it requires something that is focused and active. And that's the part that the Healthcare Equity Coalition has really reached into. So that's why you received what you received that started our conversation.
Captured my attention right away. And that's why it's wonderful to have this conversation along with the one with Shelley, Carthen, Watson, because as a journalist and communicator, I'm listening to and hearing two of the pathways to freedom. That at the end of the day, the freedom that you are responsible for is the freedom for quality of life, for living without disease, for having the tools and assets to allow the individual the best chance to be her or his best self. And that's exactly what I hear Shelley, Carthen, Watson talking about. How do we take institutions that have done this work and ones that need to do the work and elevate, accelerate, and to use these platforms to, with intention, transform society, transform the nation, transform humanity. I think it all leads in that direction. What do you think, Derek West?
Oh, absolutely. I think ultimately we have to look at each other that we are all interconnected. Mm-hmm. That, whether one of the things that I want to point out, I'm just picking race as a perfect example. First of all, just because you share the same skin color doesn't mean that we live in the same communities. Right. Doesn't mean we have the same amount of money. Doesn't mean that, we have the same issues. So to put us all in one category alone doesn't really solve the entire problem. It solves it for a few. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I really want to bring up here that I think is equally absolutely important, and we've known this for a long time, is that the difference between my skin color and someone who has a different skin color is the genetics of it is absolutely almost minimal. Or in other words, my skin color does not affect my health outcomes alone. You can't look at my skin and say, because of your skin color, and Ms. Watson brought this up, and I thought this was right on point. It's something that medicine really had to look at, which is giving pain medicine to people of color. Your skin color comes in, therefore you don't need as much pain medicine. Mm-hmm. And it's led to a lot of people suffering in emergency settings. And so we had to address that. Another one that comes right out of this is, and this one is one that we've seen in the lay press because a very famous person got involved in this, which is for the amount of morbidity or mortality for perinatal Black women. So it is an unbelievable number where we see that change in your health outcomes for delivering a child based on your color. You are more likely to have bleeding issues, something called pulmonary embolus, where blood clots can go to your lungs. And the reason I bring up that someone famous got involved in this and really started to paint the picture that this was happening was Serena Williams. She had this exact thing happen to her, where she was in a situation where she was getting blood clots, and the response on what she was suffering and going through was marginal. And it was because she spoke up and said, I am having a problem with this. You guys are not moving fast enough on this. That suddenly it changed, and it opened the eyes of things like you're not getting enough pain medicine because you're perceived based solely on the color of your skin that you're going to have a certain reaction. These are the types of things, going back to the Radiology Health Equity Coalition, that they're directly looking at. So there are ways that we're looking at, for example, local and community level partnerships, getting the word out, and coming up with a game plan to address these specific issues that are directly relating our ability to create imaging equity for all.
Derek, let me do something with you and Shelley that I do with a lot of my guests, because I like to make the theoretical personal. And so I'm going to ask you. I read some of your educational training. What's your personal story, and how have you come to the work and to the passion that you bring to the work that you're doing? And I'm going to ask you the same thing, Shelley, in a second.
I'll tell you honestly, my father was a physician and my mother was a nurse, which meant that while I was growing up, that was going to be the last thing that I was going to do. I had decided a long time ago, I'm not doing anything with medicine. And I was an engineer in undergrad. And while I was in undergrad, I was like anybody else. Well, I won't say anybody else. I was not the greatest student. I was an average student. And my dad got on me about that. And then I was like, well, as I started to do engineering, I started wondering, is this really what I want to do? I don't know. And genuinely, this is genuinely how this went down. In order to get into medical school, you have to take something called the MCAT, M-C-A-T. It's an acronym. It's basically the testing. Just like you have to take the SAT score to get into undergrad, it's the testing score to get into medical schools. And it's not an easy thing to do. And again, as a moderate student, I said, well, I'll just go ahead and take this. And I tell this story because I think this becomes very pertinent. I was in the middle of my fourth year and I had to go and tell my dad, hey, I got to go another year to finish up. And it definitely changed our relationship for that summer when I got home. And unknown to me, and I love my dad, and I appreciate that he did it because it is what I needed. I needed somebody to light the fire and say, you gotta get somewhere on this. And my MCAT scores came home, and I kid you not, this was the only time during that summer my dad was not on me. He looked at the scores, smiled, and said, good job. And I was the one that was stunned because I didn't know what he was talking about until I got the scores. And, as these things went, I scored well enough to get into someone's medical school. And it definitely changed my perception and view of what that meant and what that job, what that life was going to be. I, as a son of a physician, you can see some of it, but it's another thing to actually be in it and understand a lot more that this is about humanity. It isn't just about, I'm just going to do this to make some money and walk away. It doesn't work that way. You won't be a good doctor, and you won't want to be one if you're trying to do that. You have to care about humanity. And again, along those lines, when we talk about the Radiology Health Equity Coalition, they speak to that. They speak to, we are physicians, and if we are physicians, we have to care for everyone's health. And so that's sort of how I got into medicine myself. So
did it end up being? How about your parents' parents? Were any of them healers or in the healing arts and professions?
Not at all. And I think their story is an amazing one in my eyes. So my father grew up in a little town here in Georgia called Montezuma, Georgia. And he grew up on a farm. He was the third youngest of 9 children. And at the time, as a kid going to see his grandparents, I never understood until I got older what it was my father's parents and my mother's parents. My mother was a child of a pastor of a church. And neither of them had any kind of deep money, but they had the drive to make sure that every one of their kids went to college.
Ah.
They themselves didn't go, but they made absolutely sure every last one of them did.
Mm-hmm.
And so my father went to Morehouse, and he as he tells the story, it really wasn't too different from mine. The difference was he was actually a good student.
What year was your dad at Morehouse?
He was at Morehouse.
What class was he?
He was in a class of 66.
Okay, I would have been there, class of 65. But no, high school 65, I was in class of 70. But I did my freshman year at Morehouse. I might have seen him.
That's very possible.
Mm-hmm.
He got into Meharry, and it speaks to a whole nother important point of HBCUs helping to address healthcare disparities by helping to increase the amount of diversity in medicine. And that's where he went, and the rest is history. But again, he did it totally, but he got there because of the parents, but then the family atmosphere of HBCUs helped to move him to the next level.
Shelley, let me ask you, if you don't mind, to tell your story as well. I just love hearing the story because it means so much. None of us woke up and decided to be who we are.
Right.
All of us had the presence and the sweat, the investment of our ancestors poured into us. And I think we all recognize that we not only have a great desire and see possibility, but we have an obligation to honor and reflect and to be evidence of that which they hoped for in the generations past. So Shelley, talk about your story. Now you've come to be a lawyer and the advocate that you are.
I grew up in San Bernardino, California, which is sort of midway between LA and Palm Springs. And my mother and grandmother were formidable women. And I was actually raised by this village of women in San Bernardino who taught me that strong, intelligent, assertive, successful women were the rule and not the exception. And so my mother and grandmother had two passions. One was the YWCA. My mother was on the board there, and my grandmother volunteered. And I grew up going to the YWCA. And they were also incredibly involved in Planned Parenthood. And my mother was a fierce advocate for choice. And my grandmother was a community health aide that sort of assisted women on the Underground Railroad when they needed her care. And so I grew up thinking that was something that we had an obligation to do, to look out for other women and to be involved in our community. But my grandfather actually told me about Thurgood Marshall. I forgot how the name came up, but he was saying, you ought to find out about him. He's a lawyer. And I asked my grandfather, what does a lawyer do? And he explained it. So I went to the library and got all of the books on Thurgood Marshall I could find and read them. And so I decided at the tender age of 7 that I was going to be a lawyer.
Wow.
And I can remember going to my elementary school. And as I mentioned earlier, I was bused to the other side of town. And so they would have these ladies who would come in to volunteer, women from the surrounding neighborhood. And one of them one day asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I didn't say, I want to be a lawyer. I said, I'm going to be a lawyer.
All right.
And they kind of laughed and snickered. And she said, oh, honey, little Black girls can't be lawyers. And I was just devastated. And I was in tears. And I went home and my mother said, what's wrong with you? And I said, well, I can't be a lawyer. And she said, well, why can't you be a lawyer? Well, Mrs. So-and-so said little Black girls couldn't be lawyers. And my mother said, what? She said, what? And Pat Carthen picked up the phone and so from then on, like every
she read the Riot Act, I'm sure.
Right. Every law-related activity or extracurricular activity there was, I was signed up for. If my mom didn't sign me up for it, the school signed me up for it. But I view law as a tool of social change. And I also have continued I think the values that the Y has, eliminating racism, empowering women, those are the values I've lived with my entire life. When I was in college, once I got out of law school, I was on the board of Planned Parenthood. I mentor female and African American law students. I always joke that I'm involved cradle to grave. So being involved in supporting organizations like NAS, organizations or the Harvest Network of Schools that are focused on educating our children.
Sure.
And to adulthood. And so I was laughing when you talked about becoming a doctor and your dad being a doctor, because after years and years of my daughter saying, no, absolutely not, no way do I want to be a lawyer. Why would I want to do that? She's a lawyer.
Good work, Mom. You did it.
But she's actually, proud mother moment here. She's actually a civil rights lawyer. She started out with the Lawyers Committees for Civil Rights, and she specializes in housing. Mm-hmm. And she is currently the head of the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Coalition. And she supervises a team of about 5 lawyers.
Amazing.
And for her, everything comes down to housing. Mm-hmm. It affects everything that you do.
Yeah, amazing. Derek, and Shelly, I tell people that my grandma used to tell me, boy, you better mind your business, right? And my grandfather was a pastor in the Church of God in Christ. And he was the spiritual guy and always walked with his head in the spirit, but Big Mama was practical. She kept everything going day to day to day to day to day, right? And so she would say, boy, you better mind your business, right? And what I took from that is that in every aspect, we have to say our business is our health. Our health is our business. Justice is our business, right? And how do we then begin to acclimate ourselves to the idea that justice is something that we are the owners of, that health is something that we are the owners of, and we have to make that our business to ensure that systems and processes and assets and resources serve our humanity, our aspirations, our future. And we do know this about ourselves, that we have a certain orientation about the world that is not exclusive. We tend to be inclusive by nature and by design. So when we talk about human rights, we seldom talk about just for Black people. I've never heard anybody talk about human rights just for Black people or good health just for Black people. I've often heard our people say, for me and everybody else in the world. And that's what we always mean. Does that make sense to you guys at all?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We are all interconnected.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So my health, my happiness is as much about you as it is about me. So I'm not healthy if you're not healthy. Exactly. I don't have justice if you don't have justice. I mean, these are the things that I think often we have to remind ourselves, and not just us, but the planet has to remind itself that this is a communal effort to survive, to live, to breathe, to grow. And I will tell you that we are reflections of our ancestors. And, as I listen to both of you speak and what I was speaking about, I didn't become, as much as I want to say, I sort of didn't want to be a doctor and I got into it. It was the reflection of my ancestors that put me here. And as you all are doing, I plan to do the same. I will live until I die trying to make this a better place for my kids, and not just my kids, for everyone's kids.
There we go. Right. Listen, I want to thank both of you so very, very much for being here with me today. Thank you for the work you do in community. Thank you. And I thank you, parents, and the children that you have, everybody around you, for being in community. And to my listeners, thank you for listening here on KFAI. Thanks for checking us out on Facebook or YouTube. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane.